Take a moment for your body. Take a moment for your mind. Take a moment for your spirit. Take a moment to be well. Take a moment to be healthy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment every day. Take a moment for your body. Take a moment for your mind. Take a moment for your spirit. Take a moment to be well. Take a moment to be happy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment to show you care. Take a moment to show you care. Just to show how much you care. Yeah.
Good evening and welcome once again to Healing Moments, the program brought to you every Thursday at 6 p.m. Now, last week, Sister Sherry Sobers went in depth and she spoke about addictions, especially those related to teens. Now, this week, she's going to speak about repeated involvement despite substantial harm, which is compulsive addiction. But as you know, before we go to Sister Sobers, we have Pastor Lucas, who is going to give us the inspirational word and also start us off with a prayer. Pastor Lucas.
Let us pray, everybody. Our Father in heaven, we are thankful to be able to be back here this evening as we share on healing moments. Indeed, we all need some healing moment. Be with us this evening, and may this be our experience for all those who are listening in, participating. May this be the experience this evening for whatever area of our lives for which we need that healing. Grant us it in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Yes, good evening. We are back together one more time, and the devotion is coming from the book of Romans, chapter 7, verse 15. There are a number of verses. I wouldn't read all of them, but I'll just share some of them with you. Paul says here, I don't understand what I'm doing, for I don't practice what I want to do, but instead do what I hate. Now, if I practice what I don't want to do, I'm admitting that the law is good. As it is, I am no longer the one who is doing it, but it is the sin that is living in me, he says. For I know that nothing good lives in me, that is in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but I cannot carry it out. For I don't do the good I want to do, but instead I do the evil that I do not want to do. So I find this to be a principle. When I want to do what is good, evil is right there with me. And he goes on to declare in verse 23, but I see in my body a different principle, waging war with the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin that exists in my body. What a wretched man that I am. Who will rescue me from this body that is infected by death? Paul is describing something here that is common to all human beings. We struggle with it all the time. Some in more acute ways, as we're talking about addictions and compulsivity here this evening. This is a case where Paul is experiencing the compulsive behavior. He wants to do what is the right thing, but he keeps doing the wrong thing. And in trying to analyze it, he concludes that, there is a law warring in my body against me. And so actually what you're seeing me do is not me, but it is the sin in me that's driving me. So when we talk about the whole matter, he talks about the matter of sin. Sin really is, the Bible describes it as the transgression of the law, but I want to add a bit more to it. It's an inclination that we have as human beings to choose the wrong above right. That inclination. And Paul is describing that. And the Bible kind of highlights about 3 areas. One speaks of things that constitute a mistake. It's a mistake, common mistake. Then there's deliberate action. Then there's the failure from trying. You're trying, but you're getting it wrong. So there are 3 areas that the Bible lists in terms of sin. And as I said, the Bible calls it transgression of the law, the breaking of the law. What is known, the law is a standard of right. And sin is the breaking of that standard of right, which means that we are doing wrong, whether we do it to ourselves or we do it to somebody else. Sometimes circumstances around us lead us to behave in certain ways. Whether they be circumstances contrived by others or things that you walk into and not you don't know you walk into this thing, but you find yourself in a very wrong situation and sometimes not able to get out of it. Paul is driving at that kind of thing. The same compulsive behavior that people in addiction find and that you have found. You may not be an addict in terms of alcohol or some substance or some behavior, but there are some things you find that you can't help doing. Try as you may, you keep getting it wrong all the time. And you want to do the right thing, but you can't find how to do it. Paul doesn't, this is what Paul says. Now, there's healing required, and healing is a very spiritual process, particularly the healing of the mind is a spiritual process. The thing has to be corrected in the mind because we picked up all kinds of ideas from our environment, what people have said, what we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we smell. We pick up all kinds of ideas, right ideas and wrong ones, and we do practice them. Here's Paul back in the Romans. He says, this is his recommendation, right? He says, do not be conformed to this world, but be continuously transformed by the renewing of your minds. Paul calls for the renewing of the mind. Okay, so therefore, healing begins with the renewing of your mind, the thinking. When the thinking is corrected, then we're going to get the behavior corrected. Because much of the behavior proceeds from thoughts that we have got them from wherever else. So this is Paul's point. And he concludes the passage really by saying this in verse 25, I thank God through Jesus the Messiah, our Lord, because with my mind I myself serve the law of God, while with my human nature I serve the law of sin. What is he saying? That whilst we are living, this conflict goes on. It goes on. You want to do one thing, but you do something else. People looking on don't understand what's going on there. But they don't understand the struggle that the person may be going through who has the addiction to whatever habit, substance, whatever it is. But praise God, Paul says, you know something? I can get healing through Jesus. And later in verse chapter 12, he says, be not conformed to this world, or don't go along with the forms, but experience the transforming. With transforming, it's the word trans, the prefix trans means it takes you from one place over, like from one side of the river over to the other side. Conforming means that you're going along with the forms. A guy grows up and sees a young man smoking, he smokes too. He sees his father or parents drinking, he drinks too. He sees others smoking dope, he smoked up too. He sees others acting out abusive behaviors, he act them out too. You hear others cursing, you curse too. Paul says, do not go along with the forms, but be transformed. And how? By the renewing of your mind. That is where the issue begins. And until the mind is sorted out, the body doesn't get sorted out. We shall hear from Sherry as she introduces more detail into this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pastor Lucas. I love that statement that you said. When your thinking is corrected, then your behavior is corrected. I love that. I think I'm going to adopt that one. Now we go to Sister Sherry Sobers. Remember, I told you last week, she spoke about addiction in teens And this week, she's going to speak about compulsive behavior. But before she comes, I want to inform you once again that you, the participants, will have your chance to speak. You will have your chance to have your questions answered. If there's some clarity on, just type your questions into the question box and we will be happy to answer that. Not only for those of you on Zoom, but those of you on YouTube as well. And I want to take this opportunity, I haven't done it earlier, but I want to take this opportunity to welcome all of you. Welcome once again to Healing Moments, those on Zoom and those on YouTube. So let's go to Sister Sobers and hear about compulsive behaviors.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and good evening to everyone, and welcome. I also want to join with Kathy and say to Pastor Luke, because I really, really like that powerful statement that you said. Once the thinking, once the thoughts, once the mind is renewed, then everything else will fall into place. Powerful. So last week, yes, I gave you a 4-part definition of addiction. The first part spoke about the different types of substances and activities. And the second part spoke about the fact that addiction leads to substantial harm. This week, we're going to look at the repeated involvement despite the substantial harm. I'm going to go over that again. The repeated involvement of the addictive behavior despite the substantial harm. Now, I think all of us can admit at some point in time or the other in our lives, we have done what the old people would say, nonsense. And because of the harm that the activity or the whatever we did caused, we pulled away from it, we quit it, we abandoned that behavior. And I'm sure you may know somebody who you can see is repeatedly involved in behavior that doesn't make sense, and you can't figure out why is it that this person is still involved in that type of activity. So that shows us that addictive behavior, remember we spoke about last week, the fact that it starts in the mind, and the fact that it is not just bad behavior. Because I'll give you an example. So say we have a young man who has gone to a party and consumed an unusual amount of alcohol. This is not what he is accustomed to doing. He gets drunk and he gets into an accident, a very serious accident. But it's the first time he consumed that amount of alcohol, and it's the first time that he got involved in something that obviously had negative consequences. You wouldn't call him an alcoholic unless he continues that behavior. But what if said young man repeatedly gets involved in different types of negative behavior, negative consequences after having consumed a lot of alcohol, then we can probably say that that young man is leading towards an addictive behavior. So let's look at, well, before we get into the compulsive behavior, let's look at the 4 stages of addiction. And the 4 stages of addiction start very simply. The first is experimentation. At some point in times in our lives, we all experiment in some things. Some things we like, some things we don't like. Those things that we don't like, we hardly ever do them again. Those things that we like, that's where the stage or step comes in. So we move from step 1 to experimentation to step 2, regular or social use. And as we continue to use these substances, or as we continue to engage in these activities, then we realize at the back of our minds, we know that they are leading to some type of harm or some type of problem ensues because of the progression that we are going in. And that's the 3rd stage. But because somewhere between stage 1, 2, and 3, as we progress, we eventually become addicted. Our minds want those things. They want the first high or the first sweet feeling, the pleasurable feeling that we had when we first engaged in the activity or we first consumed the substance. Therefore, we get to a point where we become addicted. We become dependent. And that's the stage, that's the very critical stage. So as we look at the third part of the definition, repeated involvement despite substantial harm. That's what I want us to think about. And as we think about it, let's think about the fact that yes, we do things that we consider bad behavior, but that is different to addictive behavior. So ordinarily, once the cost of an enjoyable behavior pile up, people will begin to naturally restrict or quit, especially if the cost, you have to pay a very, very heavy price. This is another fact that distinguishes, as I said, addictive behavior from merely bad behavior. Many of us, many people temporarily indulge in pleasurable activities that we might term bad behavior. These may be drinking and all of those kind of negative things. And maybe gambling, maybe indiscriminate sexual activity, all of those kind of things, excessive consumption of entertainment, even overeating, all of those things. Remember that all addictions begin in this normal realm as we pursue pleasure. But when the pursuit becomes uncontrollable, when in our pursuit for these pleasurable activities, we are not able to control ourselves, that's where we find ourselves in trouble. So as someone's addiction progresses, the person feels out of control or powerless in their own behavior, despite their best intentions to remain in control of their activities. They really are not able to control their episodes. And therefore they have repeated episodes of negative consequences. Other times they may deceive themselves about how easy it is. Sometimes we feel, oh, I can handle it. We say, oh, I can handle myself. Ultimately, though, the important thing is that we must make our own decision about whether to change and whether to change a particular behavior. The thing is that for the person who is addicted, that decision making, again, we're talking about the brain, that decision making ability is very much restricted because of the involvement, because of the different hormones, because of the imbalance, because of a whole set of things. You may even say to your family and friends, not only that you have it under control, you may even say, I don't have a problem. You may be in denial, but your family know you, and your choices, the things that you may do may seem incompatible to your goals and behavior. So this person that you would have married 20 years ago and you would have made plans with, when that person becomes involved in an addictive behavior, you almost feel as if this person is, as if you're dealing with another person, because their actions and their behavior, they don't line up with the goal, with their personality, with who they really say they are. Now, in some cases, there may be a sincere regret. The person may be sincerely sorry, followed by a promise to change. Oh, I am going to change. I'm going to go to this meeting. I'm going to make sure that that things get better. I'm not going to do this to you. But after enough broken promises, we don't believe them anymore. And you settle into expecting the worst behavior and just trying to live with it. Or you may become so frustrated and so angry that you have a lot of tension, and as arguments ensue and things like that. So my friends, as we dive more into this whole aspect of addiction and how I want you to understand this one thing, if nothing at all. Addiction does not only affect the person that is consuming the substance or that is engaging in the activity. Addiction affects everyone, from the person, from the family members close, from work colleagues, even the stranger that you get involved in an accident with. So as I close, I leave this thought with you, and I wish that you would, if you are experiencing some kind of addictive behavior, or you sense that you may be going that way, or you may have a family member that you know, but based on what you have learned over the last 3 weeks, that is involved and engaged in some type of addictive behavior, I encourage you to reach out for help. Next week, join us as we look at the road or the journey to recovery, and keep hope alive. There is always hope. And as I leave this quote with you by Helen Keller, who is a true model of overcoming strife. And she says, character cannot be developed in quiet and ease. Only through experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, ambition inspired, and success achieved. As we continue to talk about addiction, let's lay all the cards on the table. Let's talk about it and remember that whatever struggles that we're going through, as we keep pressing on, our characters become molded as we aim to be molded in a positive way and to be more like Christ. Have a good evening, everyone, and God bless.
Take a moment for your body. Take a moment for your mind. Take a moment for your spirit. Take a moment to be well. Take a moment to be healthy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment every day. Take a moment for your body. Take a moment for your mind. Take a moment for your spirit. Take a moment to be well. Take a moment to be happy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment to show you care. Take a moment to show you care. Just to show how much you care. Yeah.
For those of you now joining us, I will do a brief recap of what Sister Sherry Sobers was speaking about. And she gave us the 4 stages of addiction. And step one is experimentation. Step 2, regular or social use. Step 3, addiction. And step 4, repeated involvement in spite of substantial harm. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Dupree touched upon what addiction is and why it was classified as a disease. Now, last week, we had a different presenter, Dr. Bogle, and she spoke about the brain and effects of addiction on the brain. Now, this week, Dr. Dupree is with us again, and she is going to speak about diagnosing addiction, signs to look for. But before Dr. Dupree comes, I want to remind you, the panelists, that you have your chance to weigh in on this discussion. Whatever you think, whatever questions you have relating to addiction, you can type your questions. We are monitoring YouTube and Zoom, so you can have your questions answered. So let's go to Dr. Dupree now as she speaks about diagnosing addiction, the signs to look for. Good evening, everyone. Once again, we are trying to get Dr. Dupuis' audio up, so just bear with us as we continue our talks on addiction.
Take a moment to be loved. Take a moment to be healthy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment every day. Take a moment for your body. Take a moment for your mind. Take a moment for your spirit. Take a moment to be loved. Take a moment to be happy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment to show you care. Take a moment to show you care. Just to show how much you care. Yeah.
Okay, while Dr. Dupuis is getting her audio sorted, I'm going to give you a brief recap of what we were speaking about where addiction is concerned. Now, remember, Dr. Dupuis spoke about why addiction was classified as a disease. Remember, Dr. Dupuis spoke about why addiction was classified as a disease. And she also spoke about the different types of addiction. And one of those types were alcohol, opioids, cocaine, marijuana, and other forms of addiction. Now, then Sister Shari Sober spoke about the different kinds of addictions, especially those related to teens. She also went in to speak about the process of addiction, where they were said that sometimes, you experiment with addiction. You experiment with taking drugs. Sometimes you see someone doing something, it can be something with peer pressure or something like that, and you want to try it just as a recreational something, and then it develops into something more than recreational. We also spoke about parenting and the different types, if it can lead to children having addiction. We spoke about the video games, the cell phone usage, all of those things we spoke about where those things were concerned. Then we also went on to speak about the different types of addiction in the brain and how it affects the brain. We said that addiction can alter the brain permanently. Yes, it can alter the brain permanently. And then we had a few questions which were answered. And one of those questions were, since the doctor spoke about, she said that our daily needs are between 50 to 100 deciliters of dopamine. And the question was asked, can we have above or below the average dosage of dopamine in our bodies produced naturally? And one of the answers was, if it is below the levels, then you go into what is called depression. And then you need medication to help you with that, to bring your levels back up. But when you take drugs now, it increases your dopamine levels, and that's when you become what some people would call high, and you require that feeling all, if not most of the time. We also spoke about, this week, Pastor Lucas spoke about Paul and his desire to do good. And then he said that even though Paul said he had a desire to do good, the sin in him, what we will call have an addiction to do bad things. So we all have an addiction somehow, some form or the other, whether it is substances, whether it's alcohol, whether it's by sinning, we all carry some form of addiction. Let's see if Dr. Dupree is ready once again, or based on what we have, we can ask Pastor Lucas a few questions. If you have questions in the chat, let's go to the chat and see if Pastor Lucas can answer a few of the questions for you that you have so far. Okay. Pastor Lucas, I'm going back to one of the questions that I asked last Thursday. And we spoke about parenting, and when the parent comes home and they're tired, how they either sit the children down in front of the TV or ask them to play a video game while, they get things in place, whether they cook dinner or whether they relax or something like that. My question to you is, sometimes some parents come home and they want to relax and they take a glass of wine. A child seeing that, can that child mimic what the parent is doing and then in turn become addicted to whatever it is that the parent is doing?
Yes, our children actually mimic the parents all the time. That is where, children, that's the first learning. That's where they learn the values, that's where they learn behaviors, that's where they learn habits. And the parents are the ones that the children look at and see every day. So if my mommy or my daddy or both are doing this, it gotta be okay. Mm-hmm. And that's how children see it. Mm-hmm. So they will mimic you. And sometimes I remember my own children mimicking, and some the mimicry can be annoying because sometimes they mimic you so closely that when you see it, You don't like what you see. But that's what your children saw.
Right. Okay.
And can I be heard?
Yes, you are being
I
heard.
started it for you. You can go ahead now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to try again. Can you still hear me?
Yes, Dr. Dupree, we can hear you.
Right. Forgive me for checking all the time. I'm going back to sharing my screen. Right. So I think I had a slide before that was talking about some data, some alarming data, that most drug use begins in adolescence. And that in the US, over 60%, 60.2% of the population, and those are figures from 2018, use tobacco, alcohol, or illicit drugs, or put together. And another interesting fact is that drug use is increasing among the people in their 50s to between 50 and 60 years old. Is this midlife crisis? We won't be able to know. Remember that what we learned before tells us that drug use actually remodels the brain. And so at first, the addict, well, before the person is an addict, they may go seeking pleasure. Afterwards, it becomes pain not to get the drug. So they only try to alleviate their pain when they take the drug later. So what are the early signs to look for? Remember, we're looking at adolescents, children 12 and over, decreased school performance, changing friendships. They begin to have a different set of people coming around, changing style of dress or speech. The wearing of the pants change. They want to wear different thing on their head. They talk differently. Changes in behavior. They become very irritable. They need money more. They keep asking for money, and their activities and schedules change. Now, how can you tell that a person is an addict? Or how can you yourself tell that you're an addict? We have different assessment tests, different tools that we use to gauge the level of addiction and whether addiction is present or not. So we use a CAGE questionnaire. I remember learning that one in medical school. And CAGE, A-G-E, C stands for cut down. Have you ever felt that you ought to cut down on your drinking or your substance use? Do you get annoyed by people criticizing your substance use or your drink? Do people keep harassing you about it? Have you ever felt guilty about your drinking or substance use? Have you ever had a drink just to open your eyes? I remember a cousin of mine used to say that he had to wash his eyes in the morning. And by washing his eyes, he meant that he needed to have a drink before he came to work. And I had a good friend that I mentioned before who was a writer, and he needed a teacup full of rum to steady his hands so that he could start typing in the morning. Do you ever need an eye opener to get going or to get rid of a hangover? And depending on the answers to these questions, we would be able to tell whether that person is an addict or not. There's another tool that we can use containing 10 questions. We ask, how often do you have a drink containing alcohol? Every day, several times a day, once a week, never, etc. And we give points from 0 to 4 based on what the answers are. And anything past 4 there is a high risk of addiction in a man, and in a woman, 3 points makes you at risk for addiction. And so the next question says, how many drinks containing alcohol do you have on a typical day when you are drinking? 1 drink, 2 drinks, 3 drinks, more than 4 drinks. How often do you have 6 or more drinks on one occasion? I have a friend who is continually criticizing alcoholics, but I know that he himself says When he goes to the mall with his wife, he doesn't want to go shopping. He sits out, he buys a 6-pack and he drinks it. And if she's not back by the time he's finished, he buys another. But he doesn't think he's an addict. How often during the last year have you found out that you were not able to stop drinking once you had started? So an addict is different from a person who has, say, one drink in the afternoon after work. That person has the right, they get the right signal to stop. But the person who doesn't get the signal keeps going and going and going. How often during the last year have you failed to do what was normally expected of you because of drinking? And from those questions, you can kind of see what the signs and symptoms are. If you can't do what was normally expected, then it means that you have a problem. Often during the last year, have you needed a drink first thing in the morning? And that's similar to one of the cage questions to get yourself going after a heavy drinking session. Question 7. How often during the last year have you felt guilty after drinking? How often during the last year have you been unable to remember what happened the night before because of your drinking? And blackout after drinking alcoholic drinks is a serious thing. And many people have gotten themselves into trouble. Young men have been brought before the court for rape, and women have found themselves married or pregnant because they blacked out. And blackout is not the same as fainting or losing consciousness. They're actually conscious. They can answer questions. They can walk. Some of them can drive. But ask them how they got home, or take a picture of them dancing on the table, and they will tell you that they don't remember doing that at all. But they can park their car properly in their garage and not remember how they got home. So that's blackout that we're talking about. Have you or someone else been drinking? That's when it becomes dangerous. Have your friends, family, or doctor expressed concern about your drinking or suggested that you cut down? And then we have the CRAFT tool, C-R-A-F-F-T. The CRAFT questionnaire, part A. In the past 12 months, again, last year, did you drink any alcohol? And they said that doesn't involve like the sip you would take at church if your church serves, alcohol from that cup, chalice, or if there are family events that involve sipping alcohol. Not sure what they would be, but they don't count it. In the past 12 months, did you smoke any marijuana? The past 12 months, did you use anything else to get high? Did you inhale some stuff, gasoline, whatever? Did you use over-the-counter drugs to get high? Did you buy any illegal substance, grow any illegal substance? And the part B is where the CRAFT comes in, C-R-A-F-F-T. Have you ever ridden in a car driven by someone, including yourself, who was high or had been using alcohol or a drug? Did you ever use alcohol or drugs just to relax, to feel better about yourself, or to fit into a group? Did you ever use alcohol and drugs while you were by yourself or alone? And that's one of the most dangerous things. When you get to the place where you are drinking alone, and I hope that if it's not you, that you're taking notes for the persons that you care about. Did you ever forget things you did while using alcohol or drugs? Did your family or friends ever tell you should cut down on your drinking or drug use? Have you ever gotten into trouble, that's the T, while you were using alcohol or drugs? And then there are the tests for cigarette addiction. How soon after waking do you smoke your first cigarette? Right away, in the first 5 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour, after 3 hours? Do you find it difficult to refrain from smoking in places where it says do not smoke? Which cigarette would you hate to give up? And that's not talking about the brand, it's talking about the first. Would you want to give up the first cigarette? Would you hate to give that up, or would you hate to give up the other cigarettes that follow? How many cigarettes a day do you smoke? 1, 2, 10, 20? Do you smoke even if you are in bed and sick all day? Answers yes to that particular question is a definite sign of cigarette addiction. The Bible says, the wise man Solomon says in Proverbs 29, 30-31, who has woe, who has sorrow, who has strife, who has complaints, who has needless bruises. I think you can imagine it. Who has bloodshot eyes, those who linger over wine, who go to sample bowls of mixed wine. So what are the signs, the late signs of addiction? The dilated pupils, especially from people in people who take the hallucinogens. Marijuana also dilates the pupils, which is why some people use it, which is why it has been prescribed for glaucoma. Red eyes, the cigarettes, excessive or runny nose, pale appearance, loss of appetite or change in eating habits, lack or decrease in the level of personal hygiene, weight loss, appearing undernourished. Remember, we said that the dopamine rush is so high in addiction that the normal things you need for survival can be put aside. Eating, drinking, social connections can be put aside or will be put aside just for the drug. So a lot of people who are addicted, especially to cocaine, will be undernourished. Repetitive speech, unusual body odor. Again, that may have to do either with the drug or with the lack of personal hygiene. Scabs or marks on the skin, especially with those who inject, and dental or gum problems. Those are the late signs to look for. Next week, we're going to talk about reversing addiction. Is it possible to reverse what has already begun in the brain? Remember, we said an addict begins an innocent search for pain relief, and then that substance takes over and he continues the cycle until he recovers or he dies. And he has a totally distorted perspective of life, relationships, attitudes, and behavior. The addict's denial is so strong that he cannot see how his addiction is destroying everything around him. He's out of touch with reality. Even with all the pain, he or she still believes that the drug or the alcohol will solve the problem. And the wise man goes on to say, to give warning, because sometimes even as older people and as very young people, we want to try something for the first time to see how we will feel. Do not gaze at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a snake and poisons like a viper. Your eyes will see strange sights, hallucinations. Your mind will imagine confusing things. You will be like one sleeping on the high seas, lying on top of the rigging, saying, they hit me, but I'm not hurt. They beat me, but I don't feel it. When will I wake up so I can find another drink? The alcoholics lament. The cocaine users lament. The marijuana addict lament. When can I wake up so I can get another drink? And that's next week, God willing, for the treatment section, reversing section, for the recovery section. And bring more people on board, especially those who need to recover. See you.
Thank you, Dr. Dupuy, for the signs and symptoms of drug alcohol addiction. Now we go to our question segment, and I have one question in the chat, and that is for Dr. Dupuy, and it says, Dr. Dupuy, you mentioned in the signs and symptoms, you give some questionnaires, and after Cage, you said that if you're gauged by four, especially in male, then you are on your way to become addicted. Why is it number four? Why is it 4 for men and not for women?
No, that had nothing to do with the Cage questionnaire. The Cage questionnaire was 4 questions. And if the answer is yes to those questions, all those questions, you are already you are already an addict. It was the other 2, the 10 question questionnaire. I don't remember what that one is called, probably audit. There are 10 questions, and if the answers, and they're also scored, and if the score is 4 for females then they're at risk, and 4 for men. Because men, especially when it comes to alcohol, men have a higher tolerance for alcohol. It doesn't take as much alcohol unless the man has a problem with the enzymes that take care of alcohol. Generally, men are able to drink a little more than women in those who drink. I'm not telling you to drink, but I'm saying that the risk of disease is always so much higher in a woman who drinks than in a man. So it takes less of alcohol to put a woman at risk for addiction and for alcohol-related disease than a man. So that's why the man is allowed 1 point higher than the woman.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and this question reads, if someone has a negative reaction to a drug the first time, is this a sign that person can be addicted if there's continued use?
It doesn't necessarily mean that. If you have a bad reaction to a drug, it probably means that you are at lower risk for addiction because you probably won't go back to it. Because remember that that part of our brain, the reward part of our brain, is wired to seek pleasure. And it is that part of our brain that makes us want to eat, to go back to a restaurant that we enjoyed, to eat something that we enjoyed, to have sex again, to do things we enjoy. So if you have a really terrible physical reaction to a drug, it probably means that you won't go back to using it. But unless, there are other factors that may be stronger in your life, like peers, that may be using it and push for you to try it again. But generally, if the reaction is horrible, you're probably better off because you're not going to go back into that pain pathway.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bifi. Before we go, I want to give you some of the signs again of addiction. And some of those signs are dilated pupils, red eyes, excessive sniffing, loss of appetite, weight loss, repetitive speech, unusual body odor, scabs or marks on the skin, dental gum problems. Sister Sherry touched on 4 of the signs of addiction and experimentation, regular or social use, addiction, and repeated involvement despite substantial harm. Now, we want to thank you for joining us here on Healing Moments this Thursday. And remember, we continue our talks on addiction again next Thursday. So next Thursday, join us again for Healing Moments at 6 p.m. And remember to tell someone. But before we go, let's give you this quote from Pastor Lucas. It says, if your thinking is corrected, then your behavior is corrected. See you next week on Healing Moments.
Kathy, just one thing quickly.
Yes, please.
It was not signs that I gave, it was the stages.
Okay, sorry, stages.
Experimentation, right, social regular use, then problem or risk, and the final stage, dependency.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you as well. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Question from Bernadine. Okay, bye-bye. Hi, good evening, everyone.
Take a moment for your body. Take a moment for your mind. Take a moment for your spirit. Take a moment to be loved. Take a moment to be healthy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment every day. Take a moment for your body. Take a moment for your mind. Take a moment for your spirit. Take a moment to be well. Take a moment to be happy. Take a moment when you pray. Take a moment for worship. Take a moment to show you care. Take a moment to show you care. Just to show how much you care.